Welcome to 15 Minutes of Feminism, part of our On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine platform. As you know, we report, rebel, and we tell it just like it is on all of our podcasts. And in this one, it's particularly special. We dive right in. And as you all know, we count the minutes in our own feminist terms. In this episode, I want to talk directly to you. We're not joined by a guest because we want to reflect on what's taken shape in the United States over the last few weeks. We've seen the inauguration of Donald Trump as the 47th president of the United States. And in that period of time, we've seen the gutting of USAID. We've heard about the dismantling, perhaps soon to come, of the Department of Education. Doge has stepped in, and unelected billionaires have been able to flap their wings and fly through the United States government and to do considerable harm, many would say, at pecking at, and even more, quite seriously, against this pecking, this nudging, this surveillance of government employees. There are government employees that have now left employment. There are those who are now considering packages that have been presented to them to leave their offices, the work that they've been doing over years, decades of service, or else. We've seen farmers now reporting that the gutting of USAID will affect them, farmers in Wisconsin, Kansas, and other places. We've seen a flurry of executive orders that have been dumped on the American public, ranging from a revocation of birthright citizenship, the claiming that there are only two genders or sexes, male and female, ignoring medical science of individuals who are intersex and other matters of legal, medical, and social concern. In the flurry of executive orders, we've seen those that seek to quite literally wipe away the wording of woman, women, and so much more. And of course, there's been the attacks against diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's been blamed on planes crashing in the air and other matters. You see a real scapegoating that is taking place. What do these matters mean for the rule of law and the role of law? What do they mean for democracy? We've seen a lot of symbolism at play, Nazi salutes even, brazenly. We've seen the Doge group, which has been staffed by people as young as 19 and 20. Amongst them, now there are some that are leaving, recognizing that what they're being tasked to do is something that they can't stomach, something that they find to be professionally, ethically, and otherwise a compromise to their professionalism, to their consciousness. And in the wake of all of this, could some of these matters have been prevented? That is to say, uh, an election took place, and elections are key and central to our democracy. But at the same time, as we are looking at what's taking place now, the devastation, the destruction, what does this mean for the United States Supreme Court? How are the justices sitting with the decisions that they've made vis-a-vis Donald Trump, who happens to be a convicted felon, a person who has been found liable for sexual assault in New York, a person who is implicated in the January 6th storming of the Capitol, implicated because there was a district court ruling, there was an appellate court ruling, there was a Supreme Court ruling, but these matters were going back to the district court. All of that is essentially wiped away in one sense. That is, in the sense that those legal trials are not going forward. We've seen the resignation of the prosecutor who was bringing the cases forward. And now, where are we? We're at a time in which the United States is now being questioned and even shunned by its European allies who are stating that now it's time to go it alone because the United States has crossed a bridge that goes too far. And what I want to share with you in this 15 minutes of feminism are thoughts about the Supreme Court and the Trump v. United States ruling, where Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson issued a resounding dissent, and so did Justice Sotomayor. And the question, really, for us all in this time, as we reflect on Trump's immunity win before the Supreme Court, as he strips away and already has security details from former government officials who now are under threat and were under threat, as the executive orders continue, as the legal cases mount with many victories coming forward by those who've challenged the executive orders. What is it that we can learn from this time? What does this say about the weaponization of government authority by presidents, and in this particular instance, Donald Trump? It's not to say that there are presidents who can't or shouldn't issue executive orders. Executive orders have been actually very important to our American democracy, the rule of law and our role of government, this trifecta, if you will, the sharing of the role of power in the United States. That's not all in the hands of president, although there are some legal theorists and some who sit on the Supreme Court who would say that all power should be vested, or most power should be vested in a president, and that the other branches of government that are to place a check on government and perhaps even on each other, the courts, Supreme Court, Congress, and the presidency. There are some that say that there should be unilateral authority by the president and that the checks and balances should be minimal, and that what comes from executive orders reflect a president paying attention to the will of the people or a president paying attention to protecting the health and the safety of Americans. There have been times in which there have been executive orders that we could all bristle about, including that which led to the internment of Japanese Americans, which was upheld by the United States Supreme Court in the Korematsu case. There have been executive orders that perhaps our nation should feel, in fact, should feel proud of, that have sought to advance equality, equal opportunity, the dignity and the integrity of Americans. But it's also the case that when executive orders seek to undermine the Constitution, seek to devastate, dehumanize Americans, seek to gut civil liberties and civil rights, that it's important that we address that, that that's challenged, and that those executive orders are rendered meaningless and not allowed to go into effect. And that's essentially what we've seen in recent weeks as the flurry of executive orders have been challenged and organizations leading the way in making sure that Americans can be protected. Democracy Forward is one of those organizations that's been working in this space. The ACLU has been another. There have been attorneys general from across the country that have sought to protect the citizens in their state. But as I reflect on Trump v. United States and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's resounding dissent, I want to share some thoughts with you. In that case, she offered, and I quote here, a nuts and bolts of what exactly the majority has done to alter the paradigm of accountability for the president and future presidents of the United States. Her dissent and that of Justice Sonia Sotomayor responded to the majority's stunning decision that presidential power invested former presidents with absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within their preclusive and conclusive constitutional authority. Now, that case, Trump v. United States, as the title suggests, involved Donald Trump, the recently sworn in 47th president, who was indicted by a federal grand jury on 4 counts in that case, involving actions he took following his defeat in the November 2020 presidential election. At that time, he was the 45th president. And I make clear in that case that was 4 counts because, as you recall, there were a number of cases. He was convicted in New York on 34 counts. This qualifies him as a felon now. It's yet to be seen what that will mean for a president of the United States because it's the first. So there were multiple cases that were going forward across the country at the time, including at the time of this particular decision before the United States Supreme Court. And in defending Trump at the lower courts, his lawyer, John Sauer, was asked whether a president could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival and remain immune from prosecution. And Sauer responded affirmatively. Such an action would be protected by presidential immunity, he suggested, since a president would need to be impeached and convicted before facing criminal charges. He also seemed to imply that selling pardons could also fall within a bucket of immunity. Now, on its face, the opinion written by the Chief Justice, John Roberts, acknowledged what was at the heart of the indictment, the allegation that, and this is from Justice Roberts, that after losing that election, Trump conspired to overturn it by spreading knowingly false claims of election fraud to obstruct the collecting, counting, and certifying of election results. Now, that was at the heart of the indictment. However, in many ways, the underlying heart of the case in many ways was about vengeance, retaliation, and revenge seeking, even when it can lead to a predictable harm and death. All of that was being tested in the case. Shortly after he took office, just a few weeks ago, Donald Trump issued an order to deny Dr. Anthony Fauci government security detail, and it went into effect. Trump withdrew Secret Service protection from Fauci, who served for over 50 years in federal government, including as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases from 1984 to 2022, despite known and credible threats against Dr. Fauci's life. What we know now is that he is protecting himself. Dr. Fauci obtained his own private security. But if we take a pause and think about it, it's not the same as ordering Navy SEALs to take out a political rival. Certainly not. And there is no threat that's been made by Donald Trump against Dr. Fauci. But what does it mean to remove security detail from someone who's been a critic and when it's been clear that there have been credible threats against his life and that of his family members? According to reporting in the New York Times, Trump explained his decision in the following way. He told reporters, when you work for government, at some point, your security detail comes off, and you can't have them forever. It's not only people possibly perceived as rivals across political ideologies that have caught Trump's attention. Shortly after the security detail was removed from Dr. Fauci, security detail for Mike Pompeo, Trump's former Secretary of State, was also revoked, along with that of former National Security Advisor John Bolton. The latter two, who both served in his prior administration, both of whom are Republicans. Now, from a rule of law perspective, the revocations are really hard to justify, especially as the threats against these individuals are credible. On May 23rd, 2022, Thomas Patrick Connolly Jr. pleaded guilty to sending emails threatening to harm Dr. Fauci. In one of the emails, he wrote Fauci would be, quote, dragged into the street, beaten to death, and set on fire. He also made threats to harm Dr. Fauci's family. The DOJ and others investigated, and this is in part how we know about those threatening emails. In Pompeo's case, security intelligence amassed during the Biden administration warned that the former Secretary of State and Brian Hook, his senior aide, both, quote, faced ongoing threats from Iran because of actions they took on Mr. Trump's behalf, including a drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Now, for Donald Trump's part, his response to reporters was, quote, I mean, there's risks to everything. And there are. Right now, there are considerable risks that are befalling people who've given their service to our government, which means to Americans. These are civil service employees who's given their all to make sure that there would be food that grown by American farmers could be distributed nationally and internationally. That's now threatened. People in civil service and government who work to make sure that our water was potable, could be something that we could drink in the morning, that little kids could drink, that air quality would be safe. A federal government where a Food and Drug Administration or a Department of Health and Human Services, where we could count on messaging coming from those agencies which would seek to preserve and protect the health of all Americans. Now, there are lots of risks. Now, in the abstract, pundits might square the revocations of security details in the wake of threats against the former government aides and officials as petty and small, right? That it's a petty, revengeful action, but of no significance. That's something that some might say. But that would be missing the larger point about the rule of law and the Trump immunity decision. That decision where the Chief Justice, John Roberts, wrote the decision. Most memorable for many in the oral argument were the hypotheticals posed and responded to by Trump's legal team about the harming of political rivals, the weaponizing of government and government actors to do so. Despite some alarm, it was primarily taken in jest, even during oral arguments at the Supreme Court. There was laughter, in fact, when Justice Samuel Alito asked, well, I mean, one might argue that it isn't plausible, legal to order SEAL Team 6. And he stammered, I don't want to slander SEAL Team, but I think no one could say that that action would be legal. I wonder what Justice Alito is thinking about today, or even more, I wonder what Justice Roberts is thinking today in light of the flurry, the dumping of all of these executive orders that strike directly against constitutional values and legal norms. The majority failed in its review if you think about it. And you go back to listen to those oral arguments or read the transcripts, and you can see that the majority failed in its review to take seriously the basic matter at hand. And this is where Justice Jackson comes in, and Justice Sotomayor too. In Justice Jackson's dissent, she wrote, quote, "To fully appreciate the profound change the majority has wrought in this Trump immunity case, one must first acknowledge what it means to have immunity from criminal prosecution." And it's really important. What does it mean when a court says that someone is protected from having done criminal acts, right? Because criminal immunity doesn't mean that crimes haven't been committed. So let's be clear about that. To have immunity doesn't mean that someone is innocent. It doesn't mean that someone didn't do what was alleged. It is saying, well, they did potentially something wrong, potentially something that is criminal. But that said, we're going to give them a pass. So when Justice Jackson asks and says, right, she asks, what must it be to fully appreciate that? And saying that one must first acknowledge what it means to have immunity from criminal prosecution. What she says is, put simply, immunity is exemption from the duties and liabilities imposed by law. Again, it doesn't mean you're innocent. It doesn't mean that you didn't do something wrong, but it certainly does mean that an exemption is being carved out for this person. And keep in mind, this is an exemption that was being carved out before the election when Donald Trump was a civilian. And she says it boils down to a maxim. And that maxim is the king can do no wrong. The very idea of this was rejected as a founding principle in the United States, she says, its constitution and its system of government. She ends this with talking about there are no kings and queens. Indeed, in 1882, mere years after the Civil War, in a case called United States v. Lee, the Supreme Court recognized that no man in this country is so high that he is above the law. No officer of the law may set the law at defiance with impunity. The court said all the officers of the government, from the highest to the lowest, are creatures of the law and bound to obey it. Wow. One might say that today this wisdom, this deep wisdom, rings hollow. Now, to be clear, revoking security details from former government officials who are still under serious threat and deadly threat is not the same as ordering an elimination of a political rival, nor is it the same as comprising or conspiring to interfere with or to thwart a congressional proceeding at which electoral votes are counted and certified, and the winner of the election is certified as president-elect, something that was in contention in that case involving Donald Trump. There is nothing criminal in revoking security clearances either. In Pompeo's case, it was Secretary of State Marco Rubio who signed off on that. Nevertheless, the revocations carry a terrible stench given the known credible threats and therefore risks of death, made all the more profound by the Supreme Court's ruling in Trump v. United States. Keep in mind, though, in our podcast, we always end with thinking about what a silver lining is. How do we build ourselves forward in a democracy? And in a time in which there is so much sorrow and pain that people are experiencing, it is really important to keep in mind how we might dig out and move forward, pay forth new ground, new steady ground without the potholes, right? Without that shrinkage and expansion, but where there is a steadying, where we could get to a promised land. And in this case, the Supreme Court and our courts can do something. It is not a powerless branch of government. Our courts are not. To the contrary, as future lawsuits emerge challenging Trump's threats to the rule and role of law in the Constitution, it will be the court that must hold not only Trump, but also itself accountable. My guests, my listeners, people who will come back as guests, listeners who will continue to listen, I want to thank you for being who you are and standing tall for the rule of law and for democracy, supporting Ms. Magazine and Ms. Studios. And our promise to you is that we will continue to report, rebel, and tell it just like it is. Thank you. Guests and listeners, that's it for today's episode of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. I want to thank each of you for tuning in for the full story and engaging with us. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode where you know we'll be reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. For more information about what we discussed today, head to MsMagazine.com and be sure to subscribe. And if you believe, as we do, that women's voices matter, that equality for all persons cannot be delayed, and that rebuilding America and being unbought and unbossed and reclaiming our time are important, then be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever it is that you receive your podcast. We are ad-free and reader-supported. Help us reach new listeners by bringing this hard-hitting content in which you've come to expect and rely upon by subscribing. Let us know what you think about our show, and please support independent feminist media. Look for us at MsMagazine.com for new content and special episode updates. And if you want to reach us, please do so. Email us at ontheissues@MsMagazine.com. We do read our mail. This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Michelle Goodwin and Kathy Spiller are our executive producers. Our producers for this episode are Roxy Zoll, Oliver Hogg, and also Allison Whelan. Our social media content producer is Sophia Panagrahi. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps, editing by Natalie Holland, and music by Chris J. Lee.